Victor Davis Hanson is one of the clearest thinkers I know. Victor is an American classicist, military historian, political commentator, and farmer. Perhaps that's what makes him so brilliant. He says cultural Marxism inside our major institutions and American weakness abroad has led to chaos around the world. Seeking clarity about the wars in Ukraine and Israel, the collapse of America's borders and our universities, Victor provides insight. So I want to actually start by sharing something that I haven't had a chance to tell you yet. Okay. And that is, you know that as the CEO of Prager, I'm obviously on the front lines of much of the insanity that we're experiencing here in America. For better or for worse, it all comes to my desk somehow.
Yes.
And, you know, you have been medicine for my brain.
Well, thank you.
I listen to you religiously just to keep my cool and keep my calm and find common sense. And I want to say that anybody who does not know about you yet, if they are looking for medicine for their brain, they should go ahead and look you up because really, I'm a groupie. I'm a groupie. I read every single thing you write.
I always like to hear that because I get a lot of the opposite. I'm toxic. I'm poisonous. And I even have a column on our website called The Angry Reader.
Yeah.
And I put them in and people can't believe them because they're just a slur of expletives.
Yeah.
So it's a very controversial time. I never met anybody who was Jewish till I was 18 years old until I went to UC Santa Cruz. But my parents were Truman Democrats, and they were big admirers of Israel. So I remember when I was, 13, and it was during the Six-Day War, and the Fresno Bee had a map of Israel. And they had little tank symbols and airplane symbols. And there was Egypt. I was interested in military history as a kid. And there was Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And then there was Saudi and the Gulf. And they all had symbols for the number of planes and tanks. And then there was little Israel. So I'd say to my dad and mom, it looks like little Israel is going to be destroyed because they have this. I even knew the names of the MiGs. And my mom went, no. It's not the equipment, Victor. It's the people who operate the equipment. Israel will win. And I said, they can't win. They're outnumbered. And they said they will win in a week. And it was 6 days. And my dad and mom said that. They were big supporters of Israel.
Wow. I want to ask you a little bit about America.
Yes.
Because, I was born here in the States, and I have just seen a deterioration that, frankly, really freaks me out. I don't feel like I can trust the major institutions. The education system has failed us. The media fails us. The judicial system is a failure. The medical system is a failure. Do you think I can still say honestly that America is a city on the hill? Can you say that?
It depends on what America means. If you mean the totality of the institutions of the population, no. But what the left has done, because I think a lot of the common denominator of what you're talking about is a deductive leftist agenda. So Hollywood, television, professional sports, the corporate boardroom, media, Silicon Valley, foundations, K through 12, the campus, it's all controlled by the left. And they've done that, I think, because they don't have a popular agenda. By that I mean, if you look at what people pull on their open border, or defunding the police, or the Green New Deal, whatever aspect of this 360-degree, they don't have 51%. They're able to enact policies because they went through the institutions and captured them. So they have an exaggerated form of power in certain places to get things done on certain issues. But when you actually, that agenda comes back to the American people, usually, although not at the national level anymore with presidential elections, the Republicans have lost 6 out of the last 7 popular votes. But state by state, the American people, on most of those issues, 55 to 60% are traditional Americans. And that's kind of amazing because the institutions for the first time are not in their hands and they're antithetical to the average American. So I still have some faith in the system, and it hasn't been completely destroyed, but I don't know if I can say that to you if we were to have this conversation in 10 years, 5 years. It's accelerating. And that's why it's very important for everybody to speak up as much as they can according to their station.
How do you think we got to this point where American institutions don't actually share the values of actual Americans?
Long term, when you look at civilizations like Rome or Greece and Byzantium, and you look at people who talked about it, whether poets, Catullus, novelists, Petronius, or in the Greek context, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, they all had a common denominator, and that is the greatest challenge to a society is leisure and affluence. And that was a combination of a unique Western symbiosis between constitutional government, which is the best and only effective form, but it gives a person a great deal of prosperity and freedom. And combine that with a type of market economics that produces capital in excess. So then the citizen then must rely on his family, religion, shame, ancestors, sense of tradition, nationalism, patriotism, anything that represses those appetites. Because if you get rid of those blinders, so to speak, and we have, then these kids are growing up where they think a $1,100 cell phone is obsolete in a year, they want a new one. Or I live in a very poor community where the per capita income is about $16,000, 95% Hispanic. And I was getting my hair cut, and two parents were trying to debate whether they were going to buy on credit a Lexus or a Mercedes for their daughter's 16th birthday.
Wow.
And I thought just 20 years ago that would have been impossible. So I think we forget how much bounty and excess and freedom there is. And so we're always erring on do not judge, do not make a judgment, do not offend somebody's freedom. And the totality of that movement has been, we have complete license. And that's true of all civilizations. But then the left has changed because it did something that was fundamentally important. I don't think most people realize. They used to have this word race, class, and gender. That was their gender. Have you noticed they got rid of the class? And they got rid of the class because America was too upwardly mobile or fluid. You and I could be in a particular class, but we could either not be in that class or our children are not given the birthright. So they never had a permanent European peasantry. They started to gravitate with open borders and the traditional black-white dichotomy, but especially now with Hispanic, and they said, we have a new victim. And the DEI woke, permanent, whatever you want to call it, says anybody who is not so-called white fits into the cultural Marxist paradigm. Victim, victimizer, oppressed, oppressor. And that was very successful because it flew in the face of all traditional criteria of oppression. So all of a sudden, Professor Kendi is a victim. Oprah is a victim. Oprah says she went into a Swiss store and somebody didn't give her a lizard purse and she's suddenly a victim. LeBron James is a victim. Michelle Obama was at a Target and she lifted up, tried to get a package that somebody requested. She's a victim. And so what they did was they bifurcated the United States into 67% or whatever they call of oppressors, and the rest, 33% of oppressed. And then they made this colonialist or anti-colonialist argument, and you have what you have because of your race and privilege and oppression. It's anti-empirical. And you say to them, okay, there's a guy in Bakersfield, he's never gone to high school, his son's on a forklift, they have no privilege at all, you tell me, well, he's white. He's white. And so that was a really pernicious, and that came in really with Barack Obama. There was a word was not in white currency, diversity, and suddenly he took that word, and that was diversity. All of a sudden I thought, I was teaching, and I would go, and I heard there were people that I had known my entire lives in my community and at Cal State or Stanford, and they were from India, and they were Sikhs, and they came with enormous amounts of money. I knew people from Korea that came, and all of a sudden they were telling me they were victims. Yeah. I didn't know, Victor, that this place was so racist. I said, well, can you show me what happened? You own 5,000 acres. You're a multimillionaire. Well, I don't, but My daughter came home and told, and that's where we are now. We're cultural Marxism that's bifurcated. There's no middle class, we say, and everybody is trying to find a gimmick or a lever. So when you reward that, then everybody comes out of the woodwork, whether it's Elizabeth Warren trying to create an identity of a victim, or I just saw the other day Buffy St. Marie, a folk singer that I always thought was Native American. We find out she wasn't, she's Italian. And it's this fixation in our society on race, and it permeates everything. The FAA is, we're only hiring 50% of our new air traffic controllers on merit, United Airlines. So we've really kind of in a hysteria. It's like the Salem witch trials of the McCarthy period, where people have lost their sense of tradition or empiricism. They're just deductive hysterics. And it's, I know this is a little eccentric, but I do blame Barack Obama because he ushered that in almost immediately. My grandmother was racist. Well, his grandmother raised him and gave all of her money to put him to prep school. He went to Occidental. He's a victim. And then Trayvon is a son I never had. I thought to myself, as soon as you said that, my son would have looked like Trayvon Martin. I said, what if Bill Clinton, right in the middle of the OJ trial, said that my daughter, if I'd had a daughter or another daughter, she would have looked like OJ's victim? It would be unthinkable. So the unthinkable became normalized. And now we're into this cycle where race is essential and not incidental to who we are. Yeah. And that has a lot of ramifications, especially with the Israeli-Palestinian question.
You know, it started with what you're describing, this victim bingo, which is that Marxist ideology. And now I feel like it's progressing into the other subject that you brought up, which is the decolonization.
Yes.
Right? Anything that has to do with anybody who is potentially somewhat white is a colonizer, and therefore they have stolen the land from the indigenous people. I'm hearing this about, this is what's being taught in American schools about America, but I'm curious if you're as concerned as I am about this narrative of decolonization. I keep asking people, tell me which country you're willing to move to that has not been colonized.
Yes.
Because I'd like to see that. And what does that even mean?
I was in the food store and a woman said, "We are Aztecs." And she was Hispanic, young, and she had dyed blonde hair. So I was kidding her. She was very nice. I said, "You're culturally appropriating my Scandinavian ancestors." And then she said, "Well, we were oppressed. We were Aztecs, and we were colonized by the Spanish, and then they destroyed our identity." And I said, "Well, I have to ask you a question, because I've written extensively," I told her, "on the Aztecs." So 4 million Aztecs are colonized by Hernan Cortez, who at any given moment never had more than 1,500 people. How'd he do it? I said, even with gunpowder, he couldn't do it. So I said, he did it because the Aztecs were the most despised people in indigenous Mexico, and the Tlaxcalans, for example, died in droves to free themselves from the Aztec colonial oppressors. And Cortez was an opportunist that just said, we'll get rid of one colonial power and we'll substitute ourselves. And then she got on the Middle East. That's another thing that's very strange, that the BLM movement, the La Raza movement have sort of fused in with the Palestinian for the reasons we're talking about. So she said, well, you have to admit there's colonization. I said, no, I don't have to admit. She said, the Jews that colonized Israel. And I said, they've been here since 3,000 years before Christ and before. And then I said, the British did. She said, yes, the British did. I said, but the British only did because they won World War I and the Ottomans lost. So the Ottoman colony ended up in British hands. She said, the Ottomans, who were they? And I said, well, they ran it for 400 years. So, you know, and you talk to people on campus and you'll see somebody from the Middle East who'll say, you know, Spain used to be Arabic. And I said, yes, they tried to colonize it in North Africa, but they're not indigenous to Spain. El Andalus is an import. So a lot of it's ignorance. They just have these cardboard cutout. And it's really, if you think about it, decolonization, colonization, it's just words for white or non-white. And when they hear that a colonizing power is non-white, they drop everything. That's the biggest problem we're having right now, and it really affects Israel, especially when we use these words. And they're kind of keystones when everybody wants to know whether people don't like Israel because they're anti-Semitic or not. Mm. It's hard to adjudicate what their actual motive is sometimes, but you can really find out when you ask them terms they use and to why they don't apply it. So if you say apartheid, and you say, if you're in China and you don't look Chinese, you're a second-class citizen. I said, if you're Jewish and you were in the Middle East, 900,000 of them, you were second-class citizens. Or was that apartheid? They don't want to talk. If you say occupation, why aren't you objecting to the Cypriots that are under occupation in northern Cyprus? To the degree they're still there, and they're not and I go with the refugees. Genocide, are you worried about the Armenians? How about, and they say, well, that was ancient, I don't know anything about that. Well, how about Darfur? They killed 500,000, and they don't have an answer. So then I said, why is it tiny little Israel? You have all this genocide, you have all of this apartheid, you have all these refugees, you have all these occupations of world order, but you only focus on this one particular, and they have no answer.
What do you think the answer is to that?
If I was charitable to them, I would say, well, maybe it's because 40% of the world's oil reserves are in the Middle East under Arab control. Maybe people have no morality, they're just amoral, and they look at Israel and they say, well, 10 million Jews and 500 million Arabs. Or they can say worldwide, 16 million of the Jewish faith and 2 billion Islam. So it's a no-brainer. I'm going to go with the bully, the big power. But that still doesn't explain, because the same asymmetry applies to all the victims of Islam, whether it's Armenians or Cypriots or Greeks or Israel. So you have to say to yourself, well, you're not talking about what the Ottomans did to Greeks or the Armenian Holocaust. Why do you just fixate on what Israel? And so I do think it's anti-Semitism. And it's acceptable. The problem with it now is when it was on the right, it was easily identifiable. The people were crude. I never met anybody who was Jewish, as I said, till I was 18, but I heard about it. And they were always some disgruntled farmer. And he said, I got $3 on my plums because they sent it back there to the East Coast and the Jews just took all the money. Mm. But it was very crude the way they talked. Mm. Well, at Stanford or where I work or other places, it's very refined and it comes from the left. And it's always cloaked in the idea of equality and diversity and compassion for the victim. And therefore it's much more insidious and they can get away with it. And especially with the race, critical race theory says that people who are not white cannot be racist. So it's much harder to stop than the old in-your-face Klan, National Socialist anti-Semitism.
Do you think it's an exaggeration when people say that being anti-Israel means being an anti-Semite?
No, because when you say to people that make that distinction, so you're anti-Israel, and they say, yes, but I'm not anti-Semitic. So I said, you don't like the 21% Arabs that are in Israel. They'll say, well, either don't know that, or they'll say they're in apartheid, and I'll say, no, they vote, they have political parties, they have more prosperity, freedom, security than the Arab. And they'll say, really, there's 21, or if they do know that, they say, no, that's an exception. So when that tells me that they're anti-Israel in the sense that they're anti-79% of the population of Israel. But if you ask them, river to the sea, and you want to destroy Israel, what will you do with the 21% that are Arabs? And you know what they're going to say. They say, well, we're going to take them and they'll be the kernel of the new Palestinian state. So yes, it is the same. And it's easy detectable with 3 or 4 questions. And once they admit it and get trapped, they just say it.
So you think the anti-Israel, that hatred, is either anti-Semitic or ignorance?
My general feeling is the more education that a person has, the more anti-Semitic they are.
Wow.
And so I think it's not ignorance. It's when you meet people who don't know whether a person's Jewish or not, or they tell them they're Jewish, or they're working in this, they're not anti-Semitic, not anymore. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, to a certain degree on the conservative side, but I encounter anti-Semitism in the refined, and usually my general rule, if it's a student, it's more than a non-student. If it's a bachelor's degree, it's more than not. When I get it to MA or PhD, then it gets, and they think they know something. They know the real colonial story, or they know that they have all these theories and stuff, and they're very influential. Because if you were to take a survey of Hollywood stars or professors, they tend to be very anti-Semitic, I think, anti-Israel.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this on campus, right? You see these pro-Hamas protests. I mean, Hamas is obviously a terrorist organization, but campuses like the one that you spend a lot of time on, Stanford, are really supporting and celebrating the violence of a terrorist group like Hamas. And I would say the older the generation, the more pro-Israel they seem to be, or I would say anti-terrorism. But the younger the generation, the more pro-terrorism they are.
They are, and that's because they're products of this new university and school. It's not the university alone, it's K through 12. But the funny thing is, it's not funny, I'm trying to laugh at tragedy. I mean, I don't mean laugh, but not get too upset about it. So on October 7th, the only news people had at Stanford were that somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 gunmen came in and did unimaginable things that we'd never really heard in the modern world. And then there were perhaps maybe 500 tag-alongs. These were just guys, and somebody said they're killing, raping, mutilating Jews, and they said, let me get in on it. And they followed. And the IDF hadn't done one thing yet. So what was the reaction on the campuses? The IDF was trying to find out what was happening, and then said they were going to, but they hadn't done anything for 4 days. Well, it didn't matter. All they had was they killed Jews, not that Israel was going into Gaza, because they hadn't, and they were pro-Hamas. And their only, from what I could tell, their only disappointment was they didn't kill enough Jews. If they killed 5,000, the supporting protests would be even bigger. And it took, I don't think college presidents should weigh in on it. Their colleges are in such a mess, they have no business weighing in on anything. But where I work in the Ivy League as well, or most colleges, if there's a trans issue, if there's a Green New Deal, they weigh in. And it took at Stanford 4 days before the president could say one thing about this. And he was under a lot of pressure on both sides, but he couldn't even say we condemn wholeheartedly what happened. And so that was a tip-off, that window between the actual murdering and the Israeli effort to stop more murdering, which they said was an overreaction or disproportionate. But in that time frame, it hadn't existed. So it was just a simple question: do you object to the murder and the desecration of bodies in Israel? Yes or no? And they'd either say no, or they'd say context. Context, that was the word they used. So, yeah, it's pretty clear.
What do you think should be done with students on campus that are, I guess, vocally supporting Hamas or yelling, from the river to the sea? I mean...
Well, we had at UCLA, as we speak, I think yesterday they had a piñata with Netanyahu, and it wasn't that they were angry at Netanyahu as a political figure, it was that he was the representation of Israel. So they were yelling, hit the Jew or beat the Jew. So to answer your question specifically, it depends, I think, on the legal status. If you have people who are guests in the United States and they are on a student visa or they're working on a green card and they do things like occupy the Brooklyn Bridge or pour paint on the white wall of the White House and they're in violation of our laws, or they're actively aiding a known terrorist organization, then they should not be here. And it doesn't mean that we're deporting them. We just say, you asked to come over to our country and be a guest, and we gave you a temporary legal document, and now we don't want to do it anymore. And if they say why, we just say, I don't have to tell you why. You abused your privileges as a guest, so go home. And then we might want to add insult to injury, if that's how they look at it, by saying you are in the United States and you fled apparently Jordan or Egypt or Syria or Gaza or the West Bank because you didn't like autocracy and misogyny and sexual apartheid or whatever it was. You didn't lack of freedom of expression. So you come over to this country, and what do? From a safe distance, you cheer on that paradigm against the only constitutional system in that. So we don't want you to come. It gets a little bit hairier or more difficult when they're U.S. citizens. And therefore, we just have to apply the same standards that we did, let's say, for January 6th. So take Rashida Tlaib. Shortly after the October 7th, they go into the Capitol Rotunda. That was where we said that January 6 people committed felonies, and they occupied it, and it's not open to the public. There were people who went through a broken window on January 6 that were shot and killed, Ashley Babbitt, for the misdemeanor. So those people broke the law. They should have all been arrested. And then we said, if you disrupt a congressional, and there was an argument that when they went in January 6, they were discussing the election, some congressional committees. But there was no argument that these pro-Hamas demonstrators broke up congressional hearings. And then we said that Donald Trump should have, in the special counsel prerogative, and according to the January 6th committee, he had said, go over to the Capitol and demonstrate, although he did say demonstrate peaceably. Rashida Tlaib did not. She egged the river to the sea, and she was promulgating a known lie about the Islamic Jihad rocket that hit the parking lot, and she said it was an IDF that hit the hospital. She knew that was false. So she should be subject to whatever Donald Trump is or not. And censure, I don't think, was enough. If she's out inciting a riot inside the Capitol to disrupt federal business, she's culpable. So I think everybody says to themselves, this administration is so weaponized, the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, and it's so asymmetrical that all we want is parity. Just treat the pro-Palestinian protesters the way you do other people. Not that May 2020 BLM Antifa people, which you gave a complete pass to, but just from now on, just do it. If you just acted decisively and fairly, and you just said, we had 10 Palestinian students on student visas, and they were disrupting a class, or they were defacing a statue, or they were, yelling support of a terrorist, and we just choose, they didn't break any law. Maybe they did, maybe they did not, but we feel that we don't want to renew their visa. I think that would send a powerful message.
Where is this double standard coming from? I mean, the FBI would need to get involved, right? I mean, that's how they came after the January 6 people.
It's sort of like the earlier point that our institutions are controlled by the left, and they were very clever in creating a culture in Washington that there were cultural rewards. So if you were considered left-wing, you were liberal at the FBI, the Pentagon, the DOJ, and there was a social cachet that say you work for Obama or you work for Bill Clinton, in a way that was not true of George W. Bush or Donald Trump. And so they created a kind of a magnet that brought a lot of people to want to work in the DOJ as part of a social agenda, or the FBI, the hierarchy. And the idea was, now it's diversity, equity, inclusion. And what's the result? It's Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, testifying to Congress. We should read Professor Kendi, and I wanted to explore white rage. I want to explore white privilege. And somebody said, well, will you define it? He couldn't. Could you tell us how white rage is destroying the army? He couldn't. And it was very funny when I was listening to that. I thought, so you keep numbers on everything in the military, Mr. Milley, and you're going to do it by race. We're going to make sure that this many majors or white or non-white. But if you look at the data at Afghanistan and Iraq, 76% of the dead were white males who gravitate to combat units. Does anybody in the Pentagon say, we have a problem? We have an inordinate amount of white males, and they go into combat and they die at twice their demographics in the general population? No. But what happens when you take that rubric and you insult them and you don't promote them on the basis of woke criteria, then they don't join, and we're 50,000 soldiers short. You talk to people in the Pentagon or generals, they'll say, oh, Victor, it's because of obesity. It's because we have gangs. It's because we have drugs. We've always had that. Yeah. What caused this huge drop-off? Same thing when you look at the public approval of the Pentagon. It's gone from about 76 down to 45. You look at the public approval of the FBI, it's down. Robert Mueller, under oath, can't remember the Steele dossier, doesn't know what fusion GPS. That's what appointed him. Then you go to James Comey. I can't remember 245 times under oath. Then you go to his successor, the third in line, third Streit director, Andrew McCabe, lies 4 times to a federal, and then we go to Christopher Wray. So there's that elite in Washington that runs these bureaucracies feel that professionally it behooves, because I don't think they have much of a true ideology. They're just careerists. But Mark Milley knows that if he announces his disgust with white rage, 2 things are going to happen. When he goes out, and he's out now, he will get a huge contract as a lobbyist or a defense for General Dynamics, Lockheed, Northrop, something. And more importantly, the people who used to be the watchdogs on the left that lectured us on the revolving door, Elizabeth Warren, they won't say a word. Oh. And everybody makes the necessary adjustments. So they've created a culture where careerists look at it and they say, you know what? If I make an untoward remark and I'm on the left, I get insurance. If I retire, I can get a job at Apple or Google or a defense contractor. And they just do it. And the Republicans are sort of clueless. They don't understand the culture at all, and they've let it happen.
You describe the Pentagon, the situation with the U.S. military, this kind of victim bingo environment. Are our adversaries watching America and taking advantage of it?
Yes.
Do you think this is why we're experiencing what we're experiencing around the world?
Yes. If you look at a textbook on international relations 20 years ago, they always use this word interconnectedness. So what happens when Dean Acheson says in 1950, so this is America's security umbrella, and he forgets to put South Korea in, then the North invades South Korea. When April Gillespie in 1990 meets Saddam Hussein, and he starts rambling, she says, well, you know, Saddam, we don't have an interest in the territorial disputes among Arab nations. Then he invades Kuwait. Whether that's absolutely true or not, I don't know, but that's the theory. So when you come in with this administration, and the first thing you do is say the Houthis are not terrorists anymore, and we're going to restore 700 million to the Palestinians, of which 100 million we know will go to Hamas. And we want to bring out Robert Malley back, who was under Obama, the Hamas advisor, disastrous tenure. And we're going to put him in charge of this crazy Iran deal. And then in addition to that, we're going to lift oil sanctions and give Iran $50 billion in wherewithal it's going to be translated into Hezbollah rockets. And then in addition to that, you're going to readopt the Obama Shia crescent theory that you're going to get Tehran and Damascus and Beirut and Hamas, and this is going to be a crescent to the Mediterranean. And then you tell the Israelis and maybe the Jordanians, be careful because we have these people. And then you tell these people, be careful because we have, and you're going to make creative tension, they called it. It was crazy. You make Israel the moral equivalent of Iran. When you do all that, and then you superimpose that paradigm on fleeing Afghanistan. The problem with fleeing Afghanistan wasn't just that we left $1 billion embassy, $300 million air base had been refitted, $50 billion in equipment. We did all of that after 20 years of investment, and we had a pride flag flying from the embassy, a gender studies program at Kabul, and we had a George Floyd mural And I'm thinking, at least the British, when they got rid of Sute in India, they were tough and they were afraid of them. But we were weak and arrogant at the same time. And when Vladimir Putin looked at that and he massed troops and they asked Joe Biden, what are you going to do? He said, depends on whether it's a major or minor event. And then we had the Chinese balloon. So people in the Middle East and Gaza, they looked at this and they said, doesn't mean they didn't miscalculate. We don't know whether they did or not. It depends on how it turns out. But they said, Afghanistan, the Taliban ran them out. And Putin just said, screw you, I'm going to invade Ukraine. And the Chinese sent a balloon over to take pictures of their base with impunity. And they tried to come up with every excuse they could not to shoot it down. And then they're afraid of us. They give Iran the money back. They give us money. And then you superimpose that even in Israel. I've been to Israel a lot, but the last 2 years I was very disturbed because you talk to Israelis and they'd say, we've never been wealthier, we've never been more leisured. They were true. And then they'd say, we have Gaza workers coming in and they're getting acculturated. Well, actually, we know now they were taking pictures and making maps of how to kill Jews. And then, we have the Abrams Accord are coming back. And there was a sense of, we're so tired of these people hating us that finally we've been so successful that they're looking at us and they want to be like us. I'm thinking, no, they want to kill you because they're envious and jealous that they haven't done the same thing. So we lost deterrence is what I'm trying to explain. And the Hamas figured they could get away with it. And Iran figures they can get away with it, and Hezbollah. And deterrence is very hard to create and it's very easy to abandon. Sure. We have none now.
I know that, both of us are Americans. We have our families here. We were talking about your daughter, my children. America first. What does that mean? And then how does that work with this idea of isolation? You're hearing that movement of, focus on what America needs. Don't worry about Ukraine. Don't worry about Israel. We need to spend our money on our own country. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a misused term by both the supporters. So we have one extreme of the isolationists, and they don't want to get involved with NATO. They don't want to get involved with foreign aid. Okay. And then we have the interventionists, sometimes whatever term you want to use. And in the middle, I think after the Trump presidency, the Republican Party tried to balance those. And they said, we're going to be Jacksonian, Andrew Jackson. No better friend, no worse enemy. Don't tread on me. So, are we going to dismantle the 600 bases? Not really. Are we going to get out of NATO? But we're going to scream at NATO. And Trump went crazy and crude and crass and said, you better do this. And they did. They copped up $100 billion extra in defense. Do we supply Ukraine? Yes. Do we still supply Israel? Yes. Did we take out Soleimani? Yes. Did we bomb? That was all during people who said America first. And yet the left keeps saying they're isolationists. And I'm saying if they're so isolationist, would you have killed Soleimani? No. Would you bomb the crap out of ISIS? No. And so would Donald Trump have fled Afghanistan? No. He would have kept Bagram Air Force Base with 4,000 soldiers. So I think given every time we've had an optional war in the Middle East, it hasn't turned out too well. I don't know about the verdict of Iraq yet, but Afghanistan turned out to be a disaster. Bombing Libya was a disaster. I don't know what we're doing in Syria. But as far as Ukraine goes, I think everybody wanted to give them the ability to defend themselves. But then something happened. The agenda transmogrified into, we're going to get Crimea and Donbass back. It's not just we're going to push Putin back to where he was on February 24th of 2022. Now we're going to give what Obama gave them. Obama was president. They took Crimea and Donbass. But the problem with this is Obama never said after 2014, it is the policy of this administration to get Ukraine to get back Crimea. And we're going to get, Donald Trump was president for 4 years. He never said, we're going to give Crimea back and Donbass. Joe Biden was president. He never said that. Now the war is there and the agenda has expanded. And the problem with the expansion is Ukraine has 1/4 of the population of Russia. It's got 10% of the area, and it's got, 1/30 of the area, 10% of the GDP. And all of us who looked at that said, I think if we give them as many weapons as we can to defend themselves, maybe they can push Putin back to where he was in February. And then we can negotiate. Maybe we can arm them to the teeth, and maybe they can have a plebiscite, but they're not going to get back Crimea and Donbass. There's just too much history, and they don't have the wherewithal. And everybody said, you're an isolationist for saying that. But I wrote during the spring and summer, I didn't see how they were going to break through this huge Maginot Line of Russian defenses, given 1/4 of the country of Ukraine is out. And it's a very mysterious thing now, because I really support Zelensky defending himself. I think we should give him the weapons to defend himself. But for him to get every Russian out of pre-2014, he's going to do things that you can't allow. He's going to try to sink the Black Sea Fleet. Traditional strategic logic says you should hit the fuel dumps in Russia. He sent a couple of drone attacks against the Kremlin. They have 6,500 nuclear weapons, and that's not going to happen. So, and then you look at the manpower, and we had a conference at the Hoover Institution I chaired in March, and a lot of people from Ukraine were experts. They were saying, you can give them all the weapons you want. They don't have the manpower, because there's been 600,000 dead, wounded. This was in March, and missing. And somebody piped up and said, yes, but they're killing 2 Russians for every one. And he said, exactly. When you have 4 times the population, that's Putin's logic, to bleed them dry. So I don't know what the solution there is. I don't think it's kind of like Verdun or Stalingrad. It just keeps going, and it's destroying lives. And there has to be some settlement that doesn't reward Putin too much.
Do you think that America and the West has violated the NATO agreements by getting involved?
I don't know if they did legally. That is, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were side agreements or side assurances that Ukraine would not be part of NATO. Mm-hmm. And in exchange for certain concessions, then Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons that the Soviets had put in it. And there was a sense that the Donbass and Crimea were 70% Russian speaking. And we forget that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, from 91 to 95 or 94, Crimea was an independent country. It wasn't Russian, and it wasn't Ukraine. Ukraine took it first. Before Russia took it from Ukraine, Ukraine took it from Crimea, from itself. So it's a very complicated history. And Americans don't realize that the whole western part of Ukraine, maybe 1/3 of it, was Polish. For 1,000 years, it was Roman Catholic Polish. Joseph Stalin with Hitler invaded September 2nd, verse 2nd of the Germans in 1939. Stalin came in 3 weeks later. They took that and they gave it to Ukraine. And then after the war, we said, would you please give back now that we've won? Give back to the Polish people. And Stalin said, no, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union. If Poland wants some territory, take it from the Germans. So they took Prussia from them. So that whole area has a Byzantine mosaic, and Americans are just not equipped geographically, intellectually, historically to come in and say, we're going to give Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and we're going to allow them to fight and bleed white so they can get back these 2 disputed areas. It's not. The other thing that bothers me about Ukraine is I look at what we're saying about Israel. So Israel's supposed to be proportionate. Do we ever say to Ukraine, now listen, Mr. Zelensky, we've given you HIMARS, we've given you Abrams, we're going to give you F-15s, we've given you Javelins, but we want you to respond to each Russian attack with a commiserate response. And then we say to them, we're kind of worried because you've killed 2 Russians for every Ukrainian. That's disproportionate. No. And we don't say to Mr. Zelensky, you know, you hit a bridge in Crimea and you hit a big highway in the Donbass. Did you notify the civilians around there? Did you drop leaflets? Did you text their phones? No. And then we said, or to turn it the other way, what if Joe Biden said to Netanyahu, Bibi, if you want to declare martial law and suspend election, that's fine with us. You might have to do it. That would be unthinkable. That's what we did with Zelensky. He hasn't had election, and he enacted martial law. So we have this disproportionate attitude that all these people on the left are saying, be disproportionate, arm them to the teeth, kill as many damn Russians as you can. Don't worry, when they kill civilians, you reply, but not with Israel. So I don't know why that is.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the Israel and Ukraine bucket that has been created. I find it incredibly confusing because, like you say, on the one hand, they want it to be within the same bucket. And by the way, both the left and the right seems to be doing it, like putting them in the same bucket. It's obviously different regions, but maybe it's the timing. How do you explain that? And how can you, just you being the medicine for the mind that I think that you are, can you just help me unentangle this myth that it's in the same bucket? Should it be in the same bucket,
no,
Israel and Ukraine?
No more than South Korea aid or NATO aid. And the reason is that the supporters of the war, of the unlimited blank check, understand now that what they told us and what people warned them about is not going to happen. In other words, that was such a courageous defense of Kiev that they translated that into a fluid war of maneuver and momentum, and they were going to go right and be armed and onto Moscow almost and expel the Russians. And people tried to say to them the disparity, not only in equipment, but historically, if you look at the 1905 Japanese-Russian War, if you look at the 1922 invasion of Poland by the Russians, if you look at the 1939 invasion of Poland, if you look at the 1939 invasion of Finland, the Russian army is not very good when it goes outside its borders. It's no morale. It's not an imperial army, contrary to what people say. You fight it right next to its borders, an area that it's unconquerable. So once you were in Kiev and it was trying to be a forward expeditionary army, it was easy to say they're incompetent, but now the war is back right on the border. And it's going to be very, very hard to get the Russians out. And everybody knows that. And they know that the spring offensive failed, the summer offensive failed. They've spent more money actually than the history of all the money we've given to Israel. So now they know that if you look at the polls, people want a negotiated settlement. They don't want to reward Putin. They don't know how you would have a negotiated settlement without rewarding him, but they want to find a way, so they say. And so the supporters on the left or right are thinking, if we have this separate, the American people, it'll be a killer back in my district. So I don't want to vote for another $50, $60 billion in my district. But 65% of the American people want to help Israel. So we'll just glue them together and we'll say that anybody who doesn't vote for it won't support Israel. Of course, the people who want to separate say you're using the Israelis as guinea pigs to get your Ukraine through. And that's where we are. And it's confounded by the fact that it's not an easily discernible ideological, because there's people on the ideological issue, because there's hawks of Republicans and Democrat leftists, and they both want to combine now.
What is your response to the criticism that America is funding both sides of the war, in Israel in particular?
Well, we do that a lot, but when you look at what we're doing, so I'll give you a couple of examples off the top of my head. So Anthony Blinken is very worried right when the IDF is going to move first week. He's going to go over there and he's going to talk to the Jordanians and the West Bank and Egypt. And they have threatened either that at some future date they might intervene or this, and you think, well, wait a minute, they won't even meet with Blinken? they won't even meet with Blinken, and he was willing to promulgate the lie that the hospital had been hit by the Israelis because he said that all the American embassies in the region should lower their flags half-mast. And that still didn't appease these people. Then you start to look at their $1.5 billion to the Egyptians, $1 billion to the Jordanians, $700 million to the Palestinians. You think, well, at least they didn't fund Hezbollah. Then you start to look at the money we gave Beirut that was fluid and seeped into Hezbollah, especially with intelligence that was basically we were giving the Lebanese intelligence that was detrimental to Israel. So yeah, we were funding their enemies. And I don't know why we're doing that other than I know what the reason that people say they're doing that. When you talk to them about it, I've talked to people about it, and they'll say, this is good for Israel. Yes, that's what they say, because we're making friends with them, and therefore we have leverage on them, and therefore we tell them to go easy on Israel. But I've never seen any evidence of that. But that's what they say to you. That's why we're doing it.
So are the surrounding countries supposedly going to go easy on Israel?
I don't think they have. I look at the surrounding countries and I see that Gaza killed 1,100 Israelis. I look at the Lebanese and they're ready to kill more Israelis. And the Jordanians don't like the Israelis, and the Egyptians don't want to help out in Gaza. So I don't really see that the money was well spent. I think the opposite might be true for just once. I would like to see an American administration say to all these countries, I'm not going to give you anything. And if you don't like us, that's fine. And we're going to pump more oil and natural gas and coal than you have, and we don't need you. And then as far as the Chinese, if you send another balloon over, we're going to blow it up. And if Iran, you hit another American base, we're going to retaliate disproportionately. And I would think that if you were to do that, you would have peace. And rather than the chaos you have today, it's kind of counterintuitive. If we tell Netanyahu and the Israelis that we want them pause for 3 days or whatever, and then we're going to try, of course, to have a ceasefire, and then Hezbollah is going to take the hostages and say, how many hostages are worth how many days? Is a hostage worth 1 day? And they're going to meter them out. Then all of that's for nothing. I mean, all the Israelis that were killed and all the people killed trying to stop Hamas, it's just going to go back to square one. However, if you just say to the Israelis, I'm going to hold off the pressure on you any way I can. I'm going to try to give you 4 or 5 weeks before world opinion makes it impossible. So go destroy Hamas. I don't think Iran will intervene. I don't think Hezbollah will intervene, because Hezbollah will look at what happened to Hamas, and they said, this is what happened to us in 2006. We don't want to do it again. If you call off the Israelis and they stop, and Hamas comes out of the tunnels and said, we withstood the greatest Israeli, and we killed more Jews in 1 day since the Holocaust. We killed more Jews than all you Arab countries have done since the Yom Kippur War. We are the killers of Jews. Hezbollah will attack because they'll think, wow, has a bunch of paramilitaries went in and killed 1,100 Jews and Israel didn't get rid of them? They didn't do anything. They just went in there and they quit. If we send 100,000 rockets, maybe they'll do the same thing. So everybody has the opposite view, that they have to show restraint and let these killers survive. And then Hezbollah will say, well, they were magnanimous and we pay that in kind, rather than they're weak and we're going to repay that with more war. And I think it's unfortunate, given human nature, it's the latter.
Imagine that, peace through strength.
Yeah.
Right?
Vegetus, the old Roman strategist, if you want peace, prepare for war.
You made a remark about proportionate response. What does that mean? What is the expectation at war when it comes to, it seems like there is this, like these graphs and numbers, and where is it coming from? Can we just try to get into the mind of I don't know if it's the leftist or the uneducated. Where is this idea that when you're at war, you have to count a proportionate response? Why is that even a goal?
it's nowhere historically documented. Let me put it that way. I know of no war that the victorious side was proportionate. The whole point of war is to be disproportionate. No one said on December 8th, they took out 2,500 Americans. So we're going to go bomb Yokohama and take out 7 battleships of the Imperial fleet and kill 20, and then we're going to quit. Nobody would think, and then that FDR would give a lecture to Congress and say, I want to end the cycle of violence. No, he said just the opposite. And no one would say, if the Israelis said, okay, we're going to send some paramilitaries in and we will kill 1,100 Gazan civilians and we'll rape them, mutilate them, behead them, burn them, and then we'll be proportionate. No, that would just be that would ensure a cycle of violence. The whole purpose of war is to use more force to defeat, humiliate the enemy so you reestablish deterrent. All war is if this is a power and that's a power and this a power, what makes war break out is that guy doesn't know what that guy's power is and that guy doesn't. So when we get out of Afghanistan or we let a Chinese balloon or we do this woke military, then these powers say, I don't know how strong the United States is anymore. I'm going to take a chance. And when Israel lets in Gaza people and they talk about perpetual peace, then Hamas, I don't know how strong. When you make it very clear what you have and what you're capable, nobody has any misunderstanding. So war is unfortunately the laboratory experiment of which shouldn't have had to occur. Right now, everybody knows that Israel is stronger than its neighbors and you don't screw with it and you have peace. But if somebody has a misinterpretation that maybe Israel gave the wrong signal and maybe we forced them to, same thing with us. Those two carrier groups there have enough power to destroy Iran and Hezbollah in a week. And I don't mean kill everybody, I mean make them pre-civilizational. But I don't think Hezbollah or Iran believes that. And that is what causes a war, because we did not show them the wages of aggression against a stronger power. Weaker powers that feel they can attack a stronger power, they develop contempt because they say to themselves, if I had Israel's power and Israel came into my country and killed 1,100 of them, I would destroy them. And the fact that they don't destroy them and they have all that power means they're decadent. That's how they look at things, unfortunately. I wish it weren't true. And so war is kind of a breakdown in knowledge of, it's like all of us in this room don't like each other. And would I go over and hit somebody? Not unless I knew that that guy was not a black belt and that guy doesn't have a Glock and that person doesn't have a knife. I'd be stupid to do that. So once they tell me of their relative strength and I gauge it against mine, then there's peace and then we can get along. But when you don't know what a country's wherewithal is or what they're capable of, and that's what's happened. We've lost deterrence, and so has the Israelis, and that's very dangerous, unfortunately. And I don't know what's going to come of it, but they have to demonstrate what happens to you when you go in and kill more Jews on any one given day since the Holocaust. And William Tecumseh Sherman, who was one of the great minds in military history, went into Georgia. It was very similar what's happening. The Confederates had said that we are a martial culture. We are Cavaliers. We are Scotch-Irish. You guys are just a motley bunch of immigrants. So Sherman took a huge Northern army and he went in there, and they were Midwesterners, farmers. They were very tough people, Northerners. They'd never seen a black person before. They'd never seen a Confederate. But he made this marvelous army. He went all the way from Tennessee into Atlanta, and then he took the city. It's controversial how it burned down. And everybody said, how dare you come in here? And how dare you occupy Atlanta? It burned. How dare you do this? And now you're burning plantations. You're trying to, and he said, wait a minute. You started the war. You were killing people in Missouri and Kentucky. You bushwhacked us, and I finally, and so we're coming in here and we're going to raise your city. So if you're such a martial culture, come out and fight us, because that's what you told us, that you were the tougher people. Here we are. And it was just devastating for the Confederate psyche because they were terrified of him. And so then he went to Atlanta, then he went to Savannah, and then he went to Grant in Virginia, and the war was over. He completely exposed the charade or the veneer. And the same thing is true. What Israel is trying to do is say to the Arab world, you keep bragging that you're a cult of death and that we are weak because we believe in life. So you come in time of peace, in a holiday, early in the morning, during a concert, and you butcher people in a pre-modern fashion. You think it's really neat. You tape it, you call your mom and say, I killed 2 Jews. People greet us on the street. You take a Jewish corpse and you spit out. You think that's really neat. We're going to show you the wages of that. We're going to go in and we're going to kill every single person that did that, but we're going to challenge you to come out and now fight and get it over with. And they're saying, just like the Confederate, oh, you can't do that. This is unfair. And if they were to adopt Sherman wrote a great letter both to John Bell Hood and the mayor of Atlanta. He said, how dare you start a war, kill people, brag about how you're a martial culture and we're weak and we're motley and we're industrial and we don't have the pure martial, and now we're here. And all you're doing is simpering and calling us, begging us not to do what you know is going to happen. And he said, you're despicable. He said that. And I think there's something to that with Hamas. And I think that's why 65% of the American people don't believe in proportionality. They feel that if they're not disproportionate, as the leader of Hamas said in Beirut, they're going to do it once, 7, 100, 1,000,000 times. They'll keep doing it.
Yeah.
Until they have to learn that if you do that, it's going to be synonymous with your destruction. And once they learn that, maybe they will opt for a different agenda. Maybe they won't. But they have to know that if any time they don't, these are the wages of what they did. We haven't had a civil war, North and South, and everybody said it would be perpetual violence. And Sherman, if you read what Sherman and Grant said, there won't be perpetual violence. And, you know, I asked my father once, he was on a B-29 crew, 40 missions over Japan and occupied Korea during World War II. And I said, well, after they dropped the atomic bombs, Japan surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. What did you do then? You go home? He said, no. We flew into Japan 2 days later. I said, are you serious? You landed on a Japanese runway? He said, yes. And I said, well, there must have been snipers and terrorists. And he said, no. I said, well, what was the reaction? He said, they came out and gave us tea and flowers. I said, the people you bombed, you destroyed 75% of the civilian infrastructure of the Japanese cities. He said, yes. And I said, what was your orders? The orders were, when we touched down, if we were fired on, to go right back up and circle around and bomb the city. And this all sounds braggadocio or Neanderthal, but the problem we have in a modern, postmodern society is the people who act like they're empathetic and they're moral or amoral, and they get people killed. And the people who just say that I wish human nature was not this way, it's depressing, but it's not changing. And there's certain rules of human nature. And you have to instruct people what will be the consequences. Whether it's a smash and grab guy in San Francisco or a carjacker in Chicago, there has to be consequences. And too often people interpret generosity and magnanimity as weakness to be exploited, not to be reciprocated in kind. And that's what Israel's dealing with. And when you add all the things we've talked about, the modern university, and it's an impossible situation, because it's basically saying, hey, everybody, this is human nature. These people are acting in pre-civilizational fashion. We're not practicing genocide, and no, it's not apartheid, and no, we're not colonialists, and no, they're not refugees. Come on. And I get very upset about it because I talk to every day somebody who's Jewish or Israeli writes me or calls me, talks. And it's the same thing. It's very sad. Professor Hanson, why don't you write about this? And I said, you write? Yes, we're telling everybody. I said, what do you tell everybody? Just what we're telling you. Doesn't the world see? And it has kind of the aura of 1939, 1940, 41, and it's same old thing. And people get very exasperated because if you tell an Israeli or a Jewish person in the United States, look, you just got to do what you got to do, and you can't worry about the consequences. And if that means for 100 years Israel is this garrison state, you're going to have to be that way. That means no guest workers in Gaza, whatever it takes, but you're going to have to demonstrate that it's a very dangerous thing to go into Israel and kill a Jewish mother. And if they do it for the next 100 years, it's going to be a terrible retribution. And then I think in the universities people are going to have to say that if you tear down posters and you call for the genocide, there's going to be repercussions, and that may be the university has to have a look at. Maybe we as American people can say, you know what? We made a deal with all you universities. You told us that you were going to give a general, inductive, empirical education to 50% of the population. And you said that you were going to train professionals in science, medicine, disinterested empirical science, and law school and business school, and they were going to be so preeminent that we would be preeminent as a country. And you kept your bargain for a while, and now you didn't. You're deductive, you're mediocre, you're not using meritocratic, our science is polluted. You can't talk about climate change, you can't talk about a quarantine, you can't talk about you can't talk about anything without you politicizing it. And and the kids that you graduate from Harvard and Yale don't know anything. So you broke the deal, so we're gonna renege ourselves, and that means no more student loans, 1.9 trillion. You have a $60 billion endowment at Harvard, you back them. Maybe if you backed your own loans, you would get rid of the studies classes and you would tell kids to graduate 4 years and get a job and pay you back. But no moral hazard for you. Now we're out. And then you could say to Stanford and all of them, you have $40 billion in endowment. You're getting $3 billion a year in tax-free income. And that was based on what you said you were going to do. You didn't do it. Kids are not educated. Your professional schools are warped. So you just pay income tax on that. You're going to owe us $1.5 billion. I don't think they would have hired 73 DEI, you know what I mean, with that bite out of them. And then I think we could tell these faculty members, when a Cornell faculty member says, I was exhilarated, you've heard that. When I heard Jews were being killed, except I could go all day on those. You can just say, do you have tenure? Do you have tenure? Nobody has tenure, just teachers and professors. So we should just say to them, no more tenure. 5-year contracts, you have to sign on the dotted line. You're going to write this many articles or books or this teaching evaluation. If you don't do it, you're out. And I think they would pay attention. Give them a lifetime employment and you get a professor, going out in Los Angeles and maybe hitting a Jewish happened recently. So I think we have ways to restore deterrence both militarily and socially and culturally.
I have a really hard question.
Yeah.
So you talked about what you hope is going to happen, what you believe should happen. You talked about what you're worried about. What do you think is going to happen?
What do I think is going to happen? I think Israel is going to get to the point where they see that success is possible in destroying Hamas. And I think they're going to destroy 75% of the tunnels. And I think they're going to disrupt or kill 50 or 60% of the Hamas hierarchy. And they're going to, more importantly, I think they already have found a paradigm how to do it, how to deal with the tunnels and the Hamas people. And right at the point of victory, they're going to be stopped by this administration. And I think they're going to be under enormous pressure. I think they're going to really pressure Netanyahu. I don't know if he'll be in charge in a year. And I think it will buy what the damage they did will buy them 5 to 10 years, maybe 5. And then Hamas will come out of the tunnels and they'll say, and then the PA and everybody will say, rebuild. They're going to pour all the billions of dollars. The United States will probably take, 200,000 or 300,000 people from Gaza. These protests will get bigger and bigger. The university. Yeah, that's what I'm worried about. I think that's likely.
What do you think is going to happen to us here in the United States. Over the last 3 years, 8 million illegal immigrants came into the U.S. We don't know where they're from. We don't know what they're up to.
I know.
Probably not good things. What do you think?
When I see that, I always use this Latin phrase, cui bono, to whom did it benefit? So when I see Mr. Mayorkas, he will not answer a question. He just lies. Corinne Jean-Pierre. So what is the purpose of this? And then I think the leftists are doing this. And so what is the leftist mind? How does it operate? It always operates on the principle of projection. Whatever it feels unsure about, it projects onto somebody else. So they know what they're doing. They're trying to create every year 2 cities the size of San Francisco of illegal alien. They've let in 8 million. And so they know what they're doing. So what they do is say, you believe in the great replacement, you white people. How dare you say that? But they write books called Demography of Destiny and the New Democratic Majority. So they're bringing in people who they feel are the poorest people in the world, and they need federal support and larger bureaucracy and a greater progressive agenda. And as far as the other, got to remember about this new progressive group, Jacobin group, they have a sense of nihilism to them. Just, I don't know what it is. They like to, it's a George Soros screw things up. They like the idea that San Francisco is really hurting middle-class people. They like the idea that you might have to be careful in the subway. They like the idea that you can go in and steal something, and that makes,
It sounds psychotic, honestly.
It is psychotic. Yeah, and if you read what they say is, well, we're going to excuse unless they steal $950 because a bunch of wealthy white people made laws that says you can't steal a candy bar because they don't steal candy bars. Because they don't steal it, they made poor people who have to steal it. So it's not really a crime. That's their whole legal theory. And so they have that streak. So when they see these people coming in, they're saying, well, maybe now Mr. Middle-class American's going to have a little fear in his life that like they dispossessed in the barrio or the ghetto, and that explains some of it, besides the desire for new constituents. Because their agenda is not appealing to people. So they bring in more and more people. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I know one thing of all. I was curious about that question you just asked because it occurred to me a lot. So I went back about a month ago and I looked at all the things Donald Trump had done, every one of them that were controversial. His appointments, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But the one that got people the angriest was the travel ban on terrorist countries, because he said that I think it was 8 or 9 countries. It wasn't just Arab countries, but there were a lot of Arab countries. And then I started to read about what the New York Times, the Washington Post, and they were so angry that elites in the Middle East could not come over for visiting professorships or Guggenheim fellowships and have that perch in this very affluent country and speak and yell and trash the United States. And you get the impression that they got so angry because that's what they really like. They like the idea, the left, to bring in all the people who hate America and subsidize them and then say, well, Professor X at visiting professor, endowed professor, whatever at Columbia says this, and he's the expert on the Middle East. So that got him very angry. And so there's a nihilism there. They like to bring in people that don't like America or cause trouble in America, or you don't know what they're going to do. They just feel that that's kind of payback for being bourgeoisie and middle class. Oh, you follow the rules. Deal with this.
Yeah.
Oh, you're on the subway and it's all of a sudden dangerous. Oh, poor baby. That's their attitude. There really is.
I thought you were going to say also Donald Trump's demand that we build a wall. That's another thing that really upset them.
It was too... It was too simple, So Gavin Newsom goes over to China and he's sitting on this wall. And it's so great. And walls supposedly don't work. And then I drive along Los Angeles. I go to nice neighborhoods. I see all these walls. Mm-hmm. But walls don't work. But he just says there's a wall that's going to work. And then Joe Biden says not 1 foot. And now they're building 26 miles of wall. Of course, walls work. They don't mean it work 100%, but they deter. And it's harder to come across. They didn't like that simplistic Donald Trump pushed every one of their buttons. His hair, his accent, his skin color, the way he dressed.
What he
his
ate.
crudity, yes. So I would read things, I'd talk to people. My God, he had 2 Haagen-Dazs ice creams. He ate a cheat, the way he's just, it was like somebody went into the mind of a leftist and said, can you create Lucifer in their mind? And he has to look like him, he has to talk like him, and he has to do stuff. And he did it, and they went completely. And you and I, or everybody knows people that, even on the conservative side, that were normal, and now they're completely crazy. They've never regained their sanity.
Right. All
they can talk about. And if they're gnashing their teeth, they're like race or ghost in the wilderness. He drove them completely crazy.
Yeah. So, Victor, I have a final question. Should I move to a farm?
A farm? Well, I live on a farm, so I'm prejudiced. I live in the same house that my great-great-grandmother built. Well, there's not enough farms for everybody, but farming itself is very hard. And I farmed full-time for 5 years, and I helped my brothers for another 15. But the rural life, maybe, huh?
Yeah.
Out in a rural community, I think there's a lot of advantages to it. You avoid all the pathologies of the big city. I grew up on a farm, and one neighbor was from Armenia, and one neighbor was from Greece, and one was Japanese American, and one was Mexican American, and one was a European from what we call Basque. They was Basque. And I don't think we ever heard anybody talk about race. Nobody did. It was all, there were so many other things to think about. There was no leisure. Everybody was working so hard. They were worried about the weather. We were all in a war against the weather and insects and the mysteries of why things grow or don't grow. And so when you get in everybody in the city and they get sophisticated, they have all this time and they're bunched together. Jefferson said America won't work if 95% of the people live in a city. He said they're just bunched together. And we don't have enough autonomous people. If you're on a farm, it drives me crazy. We were driving yesterday and speaking on a Friday. I was teaching a class at Pepperdine. Before we got to the farm, we had to leave, and the day before, all the power went out because a rural transformer had blown something. And then as we were leaving, we were worried because the spray rig on the almonds was blowing, and we didn't know whether, I had to go out and talk to the guy and tell him, don't spray right here. And it's everything like that, because you're completely autonomous. You're in charge of your sewer, you're in charge of your water, you're in charge of your power, you're in charge of growing food, and you're responsible on it. It doesn't leave a lot of time for superficial things. So I think it's valuable, especially for kids. I'll end with one anecdote. Maybe my son will get mad. When he was very small, I was part-time and a professor, but I lived right in the center of the farm, and my brother was farming full-time. So he taught my son how to use a forklift. I think he was 8 or 9 years old, and he was very good at it. So fast forward 10 years, he's at a university, I won't mention it, on the coast, and he has a part-time job. And he works for a big Home Depot. I won't say it wasn't that, but it was a place like that. And he's working, and it's lunchtime, and he's eating, and a big semi comes in with concrete blocks. And the guy says, "Where's the forklift driver?" But you have to be trained, and you have to have a little badge that says certified truck. So the guy goes, "Damn it, I got to get out of here." So he said, "Do you know?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, unload it." So he just, and he got it all unloaded. And then he called. I said, "You got fired." "Why?" He said, "I'm not an authorized forklift driver." And they said, "I have to have a badge." And I happened to be going over to see him. So I said, "I'll talk to him." And he did get fired. And I thought, well, maybe he violated the rules, but wouldn't a person at least say that had initiative and he did a good job and don't do it again, but we'd like to make you now a forklift driver? And that truck driver had said something like, "This is the only guy that's ever unloaded me that knew what he was doing." So that's the type of things that farming did.
Yeah.
And I think it's made a big difference. Another final thing, and I'll shut up, is it changes your value system. So if you can do things you can say the wind is blowing a particular way, or it's the almanac says that there's always going to be a cool part in the middle of June, or you look and say we're 3 minutes closer to nights are getting longer because it affects farming. You're just aware of the physical world, then other things are less important. And I had grown up there and kind of schizophrenic, and I remember when I got a PhD, I was 25, and I came home and I didn't get a job. I had to take care of my grandmother, and I was farming, but my dad hadn't seen me in a while. And I kind of puffed up and I said, I just want to say that I got a PhD in classics. And he said, yeah. And I didn't even go to my graduation. He didn't either. And he said, okay, and what does that mean? I said, I was really good also in writing in Greek. I can write Greek like English. I don't know if I could, but I said that. I thought I could. And he said, can you fix the dehydrator down there? And we've got a guy working on it, so let's go down there. And the guy said, could you wire the 220 pump? I said, no, I don't know how to do that. And he said, could you bring a water line over to the dehydrator? I need 1.25 inch. I said, I'm not sure I know how to do that. Could you help pull a submersible pump? And what can you do? Write Greek? And I had kind of a smart brother who said, that's like a dog walking on 2 legs. It's impressive, but for what reason? So it brings you down to earth. And I think that was... My mother was a appellate court judge. She was the second woman in California. And she went to Stanford, 46. And when she was one of the top judges in the state appellate court, she would go to farmers market with us when she was 60 years old and peddle fruit. And I have pictures of her, and she's got a T-shirt, and she's out there selling tomatoes from our farm and an old used Bell telephone van. So it really is a humbling experience. Nobody in farming gets any credit unless they know how to farm. It's titles, everything are superfluous. And that's really good for young children, their values.
It's real.
It's real.
It's real.
There's no facade. Anyway.
Victor, thank you. You are a national treasure. Thank you for being the medicine for my mind. I look forward to doing this again.
Well, thank you.